The parish of St. Augustine stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, its stained glass windows catching the last traces of evening light. Margaret Parker sat in the pews, hands clasped tightly, though her prayers had long since faltered. She had not come to worship that night. She had come to breathe, to escape the silence of her home and the suffocating coldness of her marriage. Her husband, Daniel, provided in all the ways a man was expected to: food on the table, bills paid, a roof that never leaked. But warmth, affection, even a gentle touch had been absent for years. Their conversations had dwindled to mundane routines. When the lawn would be cut, when dinner was ready, when he would return from work. Love had been replaced with duty, and Margaret's heart had begun to starve. Father Thomas was young for a priest, no older than his mid-30s, with sharp blue eyes that carried both authority and kindness. He had arrived at St. Augustine 3 years earlier, and in that short time had become the town's most trusted confidant. Margaret had watched him from afar, struck not by his sermons but by the way he listened. To the elderly woman grieving her son, to the teenager battling shame, to the tired mother asking for strength. She longed, though she did not admit it even to herself, to be seen in that way. That evening, she lingered after Mass, waiting until the church was nearly empty. Thomas noticed her hesitation and approached with his usual calm presence. "Margaret," he said softly, "you look troubled. Would you like to talk?" Her lips parted, but the words caught. She nodded instead, following him into the quiet of the confessional. Once inside, the carved wood between them felt less like a barrier and more like an invitation. At first, her words were careful. She spoke of loneliness, of the emptiness in her home, of the gnawing ache she couldn't silence. She didn't name Daniel, but the absence of his affection filled every sentence. Thomas listened intently, his voice low, reassuring. "You're not alone in this struggle," he told her. "Even within marriage, love can wither if it is not tended. That does not make you unworthy of love. Makes you human." The words struck her deeply. No one, not Daniel, not friends, not even herself, had named her pain with such compassion. Margaret leaned forward, her voice trembling. "Sometimes I feel invisible, as though I could vanish from my own home and no one would notice." There was a pause. She heard his breath, steady but heavier now. Then came his reply, deliberate, careful. "I notice." The confession chamber seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with something unspoken. Margaret's pulse quickened, not with shame but with a dangerous comfort. For the first time in years, she felt acknowledged, desired even, though the thought itself startled her. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret found reasons to return. Sometimes it was under the guise of prayer, sometimes to ask trivial questions about Scripture. Each time their conversations grew less about God and more about her dreams, her frustrations, her loneliness. And each time Thomas blurred the line further with his empathy. "You are stronger than you realize," he told her one evening, their eyes meeting in the dimly lit church hall. "Or weaker than I should be," she whispered back. He did not correct her, nor did he turn away. Instead, silence wrapped around them, carrying an intimacy neither dared name aloud. At home, Daniel barely looked up from his plate when she entered. "You're late again. Another church service?" His tone was flat, uninterested. "Yes," Margaret said quickly, her eyes on the floor. She didn't elaborate. He didn't ask. That night, lying in bed beside a husband who had already turned his back to sleep, Margaret closed her eyes and thought of Thomas's words. She felt alive, though a quiet dread lingered beneath the surface. Somewhere deep within, she sensed the path ahead was perilous. But hunger has a way of silencing fear, and her heart had been empty too long. And so, what began as confession was already becoming something else, something neither holy nor safe. The memory of that whispered phrase, "I notice," clung to Margaret long after she left the church that night. It replayed in her mind as she cooked Daniel's dinner, as she folded the laundry, even as she drifted into uneasy sleep beside the man who no longer touched her. It was not just the words themselves, but the weight behind them. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Father Thomas tried to bury the moment in prayer, convincing himself it had been no more than a lapse, a fleeting spark of inappropriate compassion. Yet the following Sunday, when Margaret sat in the pews, her eyes met his mid-sermon, and the spark roared to life. Neither looked away. Their meetings became more frequent. At first, the safety of the confessional gave them cover, anonymity behind carved wood and shadows. But soon, stolen glances in the church hall grew into hushed conversations in his office, laughter over shared tea, and moments where silence said more than scripture. One evening, when rain hammered against the church roof, Margaret lingered after Mass. Thomas locked the doors, intending to tidy the altar, but instead found himself walking toward her, drawn by something stronger than reason. She stood near the stained glass window, light from the flickering candles painting her face in fractured colors. "You shouldn't be here so late," he murmured. "Neither should you," she answered, her smile faint. Her voice trembling. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Thomas stepped closer, so close he could feel her breath. His hands trembled as if some invisible weight pressed them down. But when Margaret's fingers brushed against his, restraint collapsed. The kiss was hesitant at first, almost a question. Then, like floodgates breaking, years of denial poured out, and the embrace deepened. The priest's collar pressed against her cheek, a physical reminder of the sacred vow he had just shattered. Yet Margaret felt no guilt. For her, it was resurrection, a rebirth from the numbness Daniel had left her in. After that night, secrecy became their constant companion. They arranged meetings with careful precision, early mornings in his office, evenings when Daniel worked late, even hidden corners of the rectory where shadows provided cover. Each stolen moment burned brighter than the last. Margaret's world transformed. She hummed while cooking. Her eyes sparkled again and laughter returned to her lips. Daniel noticed, though he misread the signs. One evening, fork paused halfway to his mouth, he studied her with suspicion. "You're different lately," he said flatly. "In a good way?" she asked, forcing lightness into her tone. Daniel hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't know yet." Margaret quickly rose from the table, gathering dishes before his questions could sharpen. Behind her, Daniel's gaze lingered, unsettled by a change he couldn't name. For Thomas, the transformation was more complicated. By day, he delivered sermons on purity, sacrifice, and divine love. By night, he lay awake, haunted by the memory of Margaret's touch. Guilt gnawed at him like an unrelenting parasite, but so did desire. He prayed for strength, yet even his prayers became corrupted, Margaret's face intruding upon every whispered word. In the stillness of his chambers, he sometimes pressed a hand to the crucifix on the wall, as though begging forgiveness. Other times he stared at it defiantly, daring God to punish him for what he could no longer resist. The affair deepened, passion laced with secrecy, devotion tainted by betrayal. And while Margaret thrived in the warmth of forbidden love, Thomas battled the duality tearing him apart, priest and man, vow and desire. Neither of them realized that cracks had already begun to spread. Daniel's suspicions were seeds taking root, and secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of clawing their way to the surface. The morning sickness struck first, sudden waves that left Margaret bent over the sink, trembling, her breath shallow. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion or nerves, but when the sickness lingered, when her body betrayed her with signs she could no longer ignore, dread seeped into her bones. Alone in the bathroom, hands trembling, she held the test strip, its cruel certainty staring back at her. Pregnant. The word echoed like a curse. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the cold tile floor, clutching her stomach. The air around her seemed to collapse, walls pressing closer. A child should have meant joy, but instead it meant exposure. Questions she could never answer. A secret too dangerous to keep. When she told Thomas, his face drained of color. He gripped the arms of his chair in silence, as if the world itself had tilted. Finally, he whispered, "No one can know." Margaret's voice cracked. "It's our child, Thomas. What are we supposed to do?" His jaw clenched, torn between priest and man. "We do nothing. You keep silent, I'll handle it," but the promise rang hollow. Thomas's eyes darted toward the crucifix on the wall, as if Christ himself were listening, condemning. His words were not born of comfort, but fear. Days bled into weeks, Margaret carrying the weight of two men's expectations, Daniel's oblivious presence, and Thomas's suffocating demands. At home, she smiled through dinner, forced laughter when Daniel made conversation, and excused herself quickly when his gaze lingered too long. Every moment beside him became a performance, a fragile mask she feared might crack with one wrong word. At night, when Daniel reached out to her, she turned away, feigning headaches, exhaustion, anything to avoid intimacy that might reveal the truth. Suspicion flickered in his eyes, but he remained silent, storing questions like ammunition for a later battle. With Thomas, the affair changed. Their touches grew less tender, their kisses edged with desperation and fear. Margaret no longer felt seen. She felt possessed, cornered by a man once her escape who now became her captor in secrecy. One evening, she confronted him in his office, the flicker of candlelight deepening the hollows under her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered, clutching her stomach. "This isn't just about us anymore. There's a life inside me." Thomas turned sharply, his voice harder than she had ever heard. "And if that life comes into this world, everything ends. My priesthood, your marriage, both destroyed." Her heart stuttered at the word destroyed. Tears blurred her vision. "So what, Thomas? We pretend it doesn't exist? You bury it under your sermons while I carry the shame alone." He slammed his fist on the desk, startling her. "You will not speak of shame. Do you think I don't carry it already?" His outburst silenced her. But in the quiet that followed, Margaret realized something chilling. Their affair had shifted. What once gave her warmth now shackled her. Love had soured into fear, and Thomas's devotion was no longer to her, but to the preservation of his own life. Outside the church walls, gossip began to stir. Neighbors noticed Margaret's sudden brightness fading, the way she withdrew from gatherings, how her dresses hung looser around her form. Daniel heard whispers too, though no one dared speak plainly. He began watching her more closely, catching the tremors in her hands, the distracted way her eyes lingered on nothing. One night, while she washed dishes, he approached quietly, his voice low. "Is there something you're not telling me, Margaret?" Her hands froze in the suds. "No," she whispered without turning, but the hesitation, the thinness of her voice only deepened his suspicion. Meanwhile, Thomas's sermons grew heavier, tinged with desperation, hellfire, sin, repentance. Parishioners murmured about the shift, some nodding with fervor, others unsettled by his intensity. But Margaret knew the truth. His sermons were not for them. They were for himself, a man clinging to a crumbling mask. Each passing day pulled her deeper into the shadows of her own choices. Fear pressed against her chest with every beat of her heart, and the life growing inside her felt less like hope and more like a ticking clock. And somewhere deep within, Margaret understood. This secret could not remain buried forever. Secrets never did. The night Thomas arranged the procedure, rain fell in relentless sheets, as if the heavens themselves mourned. Margaret sat in the back seat of his car, hands clenched on her lap, her body trembling despite the warmth of the heater. She couldn't look at him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed on the road ahead, jaw clenched as though silence alone could smother the storm that raged between them. The clinic was far from town, hidden on the outskirts where shadows lingered and questions rarely followed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Margaret was led inside, her steps heavy, her throat dry. Papers were signed, hushed words exchanged, and then she was swallowed into a sterile room that reeked of antiseptic. When it was over, she lay staring at the ceiling, hollow, emptied in ways she could not name. Her body ached, but it was nothing compared to the cavern carved into her soul. Thomas appeared at her side, his face pale, his voice low. "It had to be done," he said, not daring to meet her eyes. Margaret turned her face away, tears sliding silently across her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to claw at him, to demand why he had forced her into this abyss. But her voice refused to rise. Instead, silence wrapped around her like a shroud, heavier than any words could ever be. The days that followed were a blur of grief and rage. She woke in the night sobbing into her pillow, pressing a hand to her stomach as if searching for what had been taken. By day, she painted on her mask, smiling at neighbors, setting the table, folding Daniel's shirts with mechanical precision. But the cracks in her facade deepened, Daniel noticed. At dinner, he watched her closely, his fork hovering midair as her eyes glazed over. "You've been gone late a lot," he said one evening. his tone sharp but quiet. "Where do you go?" Margaret's breath hitched. "The church," she whispered too quickly. "For prayer." Daniel leaned back, studying her with narrowed eyes. "You cry in your sleep, Margaret." "I hear you. That's not prayer." She gripped her napkin until it tore in her hands. "I'm fine. Please just let it be." But Daniel wasn't fooled. The man who had once seemed distant and disinterested now became relentless, prowling her silence like a predator circling prey. He began asking more questions, watching her movements, his suspicion sharpening with every lie she spun. Meanwhile, Thomas grew colder. The tenderness he once offered was gone, replaced by a calculating distance. Their meetings were no longer stolen moments of passion, but suffocating encounters where he lectured her about secrecy, about the need to bury everything beneath layers of obedience. "You must forget," he told her one evening in the rectory, his voice stern, his fingers gripping her wrist until it ached. "If you speak, you destroy us both." Margaret yanked her arm free, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "You destroyed me already." For the first time, Thomas faltered. His mouth opened, then closed, his eyes flickering with something like guilt before hardening once again. At home, the walls closed in. Margaret found herself staring at the bathroom mirror for long minutes, tracing the lines of exhaustion etched into her face. Her reflection looked like a stranger, a woman hollowed out by choices never truly her own. Daniel's suspicion grew unbearable. He began appearing at the church, claiming he wanted to hear Thomas preach more, though Margaret knew he was following her. She caught him one night outside their bedroom window, staring up as if he expected to see her ghost slip away. Her world had become a cage. On one side stood Thomas, demanding silence, his dominance heavy as chains. On the other, Daniel, circling with doubt, searching for answers she could never safely give. Margaret was trapped between them, wife, sinner, victim, all roles merging into one suffocating truth. The shame gnawed at her like a living thing, and in the stillness of night, she wondered if she would ever escape alive. The first whispers began in the grocery store aisle. A pair of women leaned close over stacked apples, lowering their voices to a hush. "She spends a lot of time at church," one murmured. "Too much, and always with Father Thomas." The other woman pursed her lips, glancing toward Margaret as she passed by with her basket. Their eyes lingered on her, sharp and probing, as though they could peel away her skin to expose the secrets she tried so desperately to bury. By the time Margaret returned home, her stomach churned with unease. Small towns thrived on speculation, and gossip spread faster than wildfire. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself people invented stories out of boredom. But late that evening, she spotted her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, lingering at the end of the driveway, gaze fixed on her door as though waiting for a performance to begin. Margaret shut the curtains quickly, heart hammering. The rumors gained momentum when someone claimed they had seen her slipping out of Thomas's car late at night. Margaret didn't know who had spotted them, or how much they had seen, but the lie of her carefully constructed life began to unravel. At the dinner table, Daniel's eyes cut sharper than any gossip. He cleared his throat, setting his fork down with deliberate calm. "Margaret," he said slowly, "people are talking. About you. About him." Her chest tightened. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. "You know who." His voice was low, dangerous in its restraint. "Father Thomas." Margaret's heart thundered, but she forced her face into practiced indignation. "That's absurd," she snapped. "He's my priest. I seek guidance from him. That's all." Daniel leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table. "Guidance doesn't look like late nights. Guidance doesn't make you cry in your sleep." Her eyes flashed with anger, partly at him, partly at herself. "How dare you question my faith? You've ignored me for years, and now you suddenly care where I go. Don't twist my devotion into filth." The sharpness of her voice silenced the room. Daniel stared at her, muscles taut, his knuckles white around the edge of his plate. But he didn't speak again. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. That night, Margaret lay awake, trembling. She knew she had bought herself time, but not freedom. Daniel's suspicion was no longer vague. It had teeth, and teeth always found flesh. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas felt the rumors closing in like smoke in a suffocating room. Parishioners had begun looking at him differently. Too politely, too carefully. He noticed their whispers dying the moment he stepped into a room. His sermons faltered. The confident rhythm of his words broke with nervous stammers. In his office, he paced endlessly, muttering prayers that rang hollow. He no longer spoke to Margaret with affection, but with urgency, with commands. "You must be careful," he hissed during one stolen meeting in the rectory. "No more late-night visits. No more reckless looks in public. If Daniel suspects, if the bishop hears, everything collapses." Margaret sat rigid in the wooden chair, her hands clenched in her lap. "It's already collapsing," she whispered. Thomas's eyes burned with fear rather than compassion. "Then hold it together. For both of us." She stared at him, realizing how far his words had shifted. Once he had told her she was beautiful, cherished, the answer to his unspoken prayers. Now she was only a liability, a weakness to be managed. His desperation seeped into her bones, turning her sorrow into simmering resentment. Back home, Daniel's suspicion festered. He began to shadow her more openly, following her to the market, questioning her phone calls, hovering too long when she left the room. One evening, she found him standing in the doorway of their bedroom, watching her with cold intensity. "Margaret," he said, voice steady, "if there's something you're not telling me, you'll regret it." Her breath caught, fear flickering beneath her defiance. "You don't own me," she shot back. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more, leaving the words to echo in the silence between them. The walls were closing in from all sides, neighbors whispering, Daniel circling, Thomas unraveling. Margaret felt the threads of her double life slipping from her hands, one by one, until only the mask remained. And even that was cracking. The church was nearly empty that night, its stone walls breathing the chill of autumn. Candles flickered against the altar, their flames bending under unseen drafts, and the faint smell of incense clung to the air like a ghost. Margaret stood in the nave, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes, hollow with exhaustion, drifted toward the crucifix above, as if searching for mercy in wood and shadow. Thomas entered from the side door, his cassock swaying with his hurried steps. He shut the door with more force than necessary, the echo rolling like thunder through the silence. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low but sharp. Margaret turned, meeting his gaze with quiet defiance. "Where else would I go? You wanted me to stay hidden, but I'm drowning. And you don't even see me anymore. All you see is risk." Thomas's jaw clenched. He moved closer, his shadow stretching over hers. "Do you think I don't carry the weight of this every day? My vows, my parish, my God, ruined if they discover what we've done." "What you made me do," Margaret snapped, her voice breaking. "You made me end a life I wanted to keep. You promised me love, but all I've known is shame and silence." Her words sliced through him, dragging color into his cheeks. He reached for her arm, gripping too hard, his nails biting into her skin. "Quiet," he hissed. "If anyone hears," she wrenched free, her voice rising. "Let them hear. Let the whole town know the priest they worship hides sin beneath his robes." The candles trembled in the draft, as her cry echoed through the nave. For a moment, Thomas's face collapsed into something vulnerable. Fear, desperation, longing. But it hardened quickly, eyes darkening like a storm gathering. "Do you think you can walk away now?" he demanded, voice shaking with fury. "After everything we've risked? After everything I've sacrificed?" Margaret's tears streaked her cheeks, but her voice steadied. "I don't love you anymore, Thomas. I don't even know if I ever did. All I want is freedom." Her words were a dagger. He staggered back a step, chest heaving, his hands trembling as if holding an invisible weight. For years he had buried his doubts beneath rituals and prayers, convincing himself their bond was divine, not destructive. But hearing her rejection tore through that illusion, leaving only raw, uncontainable rage. "You can't leave me," he whispered, then louder. "You won't leave me." He lunged, grabbing her shoulders. She fought back, striking at his chest, her voice breaking into screams that filled the sacred space. They stumbled toward the altar, colliding with the heavy wooden rail. Candles toppled, spilling wax and flame across the cloth. The crucifix loomed above them, indifferent to the violence below. "Let me go," she cried, her voice echoing through the hollow church. But Thomas's grip only tightened. His fury swallowed him whole. In a blur of desperation, he struck her, the sound cracking like a whip against the stone silence. Margaret fell, her body collapsing against the marble floor with a sickening thud. Her breath rattled, shallow and fading. Thomas froze, staring at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. The ringing in his ears drowned out everything. The world, the candles, even God. He knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders. "Margaret, please." His voice broke into a whisper, a plea born too late. Her eyes fluttered, tears still clinging to the lashes, but no words escaped. Her chest rose once more, then stilled. The silence that followed was unbearable. For a moment, Thomas thought the church itself might collapse under the weight of his sin. He pressed trembling fingers to her throat, searching for life, finding none. Her stillness mocked him. The woman who had once ignited forbidden desire was gone, extinguished on holy ground. Panic clawed at him. He dragged her body into the sacristy, heart hammering, every movement frantic and clumsy. He pulled an old tapestry from storage, wrapping her tightly, the fabric soaking the last traces of warmth from her skin. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each one louder than the silence pressing in from every corner. He hid her in the storage chamber beneath the sacristy floor, where dust and forgotten relics lay buried. The act felt both surreal and inevitable, as though every sin and secret had been leading to this moment. When he emerged, his cassock was smeared with dirt, his hands trembling so violently he could barely lace them in prayer. He dropped to his knees before the altar, whispering desperate words to a God he no longer believed was listening. "Forgive me," he rasped. "Forgive me. I had no choice." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were hollow. There was no forgiveness in this place anymore. Only blood on holy ground, and a silence that would haunt him until the day truth clawed its way back into the light. Margaret's absence was first explained away as a retreat, a break from the pressures of home. Daniel told himself she might have gone to visit a distant friend, though no names came to mind. But as the days passed, the silence in the house thickened, echoing louder than any presence ever could. Her clothes hung untouched in the closet. Her toothbrush sat beside his, bristles still damp from the last morning she used it. Daniel's denial cracked under the weight of absence. It was then that Detective Harris arrived, a man with steady eyes and a reputation for patience. Harris began not with accusations, but with questions. He sat in Daniel's living room, notebook balanced on his knee. "When was the last time you saw your wife?" Daniel's hands fumbled as he poured coffee he didn't drink. "2 nights ago, she seemed distant, but she's been that way for months." His voice faltered. "I thought it was me. Thought she hated the life I gave her," Harris scribbled, his gaze never leaving Daniel's trembling fingers. "You didn't think she might have been seeing someone else?" Daniel froze, the question striking like a knife. He shook his head too quickly. "No, she was faithful." But even as the words left him, fragments of doubt resurfaced. The late nights, the unexplained tears, the coldness that had seeped into their marriage. Guilt gnawed at him, but so did suspicion. When Harris visited the parish, Thomas greeted him with rehearsed calm. The priest's cassock hung neatly, his voice coded in authority, yet beneath the polished words, a tremor betrayed him. "Yes, Mrs. Bennet sought my counsel often," Thomas admitted, his hands folded too tightly. "She was troubled, you see. Her marriage weighed heavily on her." "Troubled how?" Harris pressed. Thomas hesitated, then offered vague platitudes about loneliness and devotion. But the detective noted the beads of sweat along his hairline despite the cool sanctuary air. The cracks widened when Harris checked Thomas's accounts of his whereabouts. His stories shifted with each retelling. Sometimes he had been at evening prayers, sometimes visiting a parishioner. Timelines tangled, and Harris's pen scratched relentlessly across the page. Daniel's grief deepened into suspicion when whispers from town reached him. The neighbor recalled seeing Margaret near Thomas's car late at night. Another mentioned heated arguments muffled inside the rectory walls. Each rumor pierced Daniel with equal parts rage and regret. He replayed every conversation, every glance his wife had stolen away, until the truth began to settle like poison in his veins. Harris confronted Thomas again, this time with precision. "Margaret was pregnant, wasn't she?" The question landed like a hammer. Thomas's face drained of color. He tried to stand, to deflect with scripture, but Harris's stare held him pinned. "There was no child," Thomas muttered at last, voice breaking. "It was handled." The detective leaned forward, his voice steady, merciless. "Handled how?" Silence answered, heavier than words. Thomas's hands shook as he clutched the crucifix at his chest, but his prayers tangled into whispers no longer meant for God. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The affair, the pregnancy, the abortion carried out in secrecy, the collapse of Margaret's spirit, and finally her vanishing. The picture painted was damning, even without the body. In Daniel's eyes, grief shifted into fury. He realized he had failed her twice, first by abandoning her emotionally, and then by not seeing the danger she had walked into. Every unanswered cry, every night she had turned away from him, now replayed as evidence of his blindness. Detective Harris closed his notebook with quiet finality. "This isn't just a missing person case anymore," he said. "It's a confession waiting to be heard." The stage was set. The sanctuary that once promised salvation now reeked of secrets. And Thomas, no longer the holy man the town revered, stood exposed as a man unraveling under the weight of his own sins. The arrest came at dawn, when the bells of the parish should have rung to call the faithful to prayer. Instead, the echo of sirens filled the still air, their wail cutting through the quiet streets. Parishioners gathered in clusters, robes pulled tight against the morning chill. Eyes wide as Father Thomas was led from the rectory in handcuffs. His collar, once a symbol of reverence, now seemed a mark of mockery. He did not bow his head. Instead, he scanned the crowd, his lips twisting into something between defiance and dread. Detective Harris, steady as ever, read the charges aloud. Suspicion of murder, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority. The words hung in the air like a curse. Some wept. Others whispered that God himself had turned his face away. News spread quickly beyond the parish walls. By afternoon, the town was ablaze with headlines. Priest accused in woman's disappearance. What had once been hushed rumor now stood as brutal fact. The faithful who had once sought Thomas's guidance now recoiled at his name, while skeptics muttered that their suspicions had been confirmed all along. The church doors, once open to all, now stood locked beneath the weight of scandal. In court, the facade Thomas had worn so carefully began to crumble. His lawyers painted him as a man of faith undone by temptation, a shepherd led astray by the burdens of those he served. But the evidence told another story, of deceit, coercion, and violence cloaked in scripture. Forensic reports, witness testimony, and his own contradictions left no room for redemption. Thomas attempted to speak, rising from the stand with trembling hands. "I gave my life to God," he declared, voice sharp with desperation. "It was Margaret who sinned, Margaret who tempted me." His words were drowned by the murmur of the courtroom, disbelief and outrage swelling in unison. The judge's gavel struck like thunder. "You will not slander the dead to save yourself." Daniel sat at the back, shoulders bent beneath invisible weight. He had avoided the trial as long as possible, yet here he was, drawn to witness the man who had stolen everything from him. His grief was a quiet, corrosive thing, but it sharpened into clarity as he watched Thomas squirm under cross-examination. He realized then that Margaret had never been free, neither in life nor in death. Both her silence and her suffering had been shackled to the priest's shadow. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some cheered, but Daniel simply closed his eyes. Justice, though cold, had spoken. Days later, he visited Margaret's grave. The autumn wind carried the scent of damp leaves as he laid fresh lilies on the stone. "I should have seen you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have fought for you." His fingers traced her name, carved deep into granite, the only permanence left of her fragile existence. In that moment, he wept not just for her death, but for the marriage that had withered under unspoken truths. Silence had destroyed them as surely as sin. Meanwhile, behind the iron bars of prison, Thomas faced his new congregation, rows of indifferent faces, hardened by their own crimes. A crucifix hung on the far wall, its wooden Christ gazing down with eternal sorrow. Thomas stared back, eyes hollow yet unrepentant. Faith, once his armor, had become his prison. He whispered prayers that no longer reached heaven, words stripped of meaning, and still he clung to his defiance. He told himself he had been wronged, that his sins were no greater than those who judged him. Yet in the stillness of his cell, the truth gnawed at him. He had not been condemned by man alone. The gavel had fallen, the verdict sealed. There would be no mercy, not in the eyes of the law, not in the whispers of the parish, and not in the silence of the grave.